Hello, it's me. Do you know what the first feathered dinosaur was? Well, if you'd asked this question 20 years ago, paleontologists would have answered that the first feathered dinosaur was the famous Archaeopteryx. But new finds have complicated the matter and turned our understanding of the origins of feathers upside down. And today we will try to find out who was first, Microraptor or Archaeopteryx. Let's start the show. The origin of feathers is one of the most intriguing questions in all of evolutionary biology. The oldest undisputed feathers come from the late Jurassic, early Cretaceous period around 120 million years ago, and they came from a group of small carnivorous dinosaurs called theropods. This group includes the famous Tyrannosaurus rex, Velociraptor, and many others. All theropods were related to each other in the same way that all dogs are related, for example, but unlike dogs, theropods were not a single species. Theropods include hundreds of different species which lived during the Mesozoic era. But before we can talk about feathers, we need to understand what dinosaurs are. Dinosaurs are reptiles just like snakes and crocodiles. This group of animals is called archosaurs. Some archosaurs gave rise to the first dinosaurs about 230 million years ago, but these animals weren't like the dinosaurs that most people imagine. They were small, lizard-like creatures. It wasn't until the late Triassic that the first true dinosaurs appeared, and they quickly became the dominant terrestrial vertebrates on the planet. It is often said that dinosaurs were reptiles, and in fact, they were more like today's crocodiles than any other living animal. Like crocodiles, dinosaurs were mostly large, bulky animals with thick, scaly skin and powerful jaws. But contrary to popular belief, dinosaurs were not cold-blooded. Their body temperature was closer to ours, which means they were warm-blooded like mammals and birds. In fact, at the end of the Triassic, the climate cooled considerably, and only dinosaurs with high body temperature could survive in such conditions. In other words, being warm-blooded helped dinosaurs survive and thrive, and probably that's why birds evolved from dinosaurs. Birds are the only extant dinosaurs. Although the last dinosaurs died out 66 million years ago, birds still live among us. And I think you've already understood that the story of feathered dinosaurs is essentially the story of the origin of feathers and flight. Birds are the only animals that can fly, or at least fly well. Yes, bats can fly too, but they use membranes stretched between their fingers, not feathers. So the secret of feathers lies in the bones. After all, it is hard to believe that the ancestors of birds were ordinary dinosaurs. But then again, it is also hard to believe that the ancestors of whales were ordinary pigs. Yet we have fossils proving that both of them did evolve from terrestrial animals. In other words, if we want to understand how feathers appeared, we need to look at the skeletons of dinosaurs. And now, we finally get to the mysterious Microraptor. This dinosaur was discovered in northeastern China in 2000, and it was immediately clear that it was no ordinary dinosaur. Microraptor had feathers. At first, scientists thought that Microraptor was just a very bizarre bird that lived 120 million years ago. But after studying its skull, feathers, and forelimbs, scientists realized that it was not a bird, but a feathered dinosaur. Moreover, its appearance suggests that Microraptor may have been the ancestor of birds. But when did it live? To date, Microraptor fossils have been found in rocks dated to the early Cretaceous. But recently, thanks to new techniques, researchers have been able to date these rocks more precisely. Turns out that Microraptor lived much earlier than previously thought. The age of the rocks in which the first specimens were found is 130 million years. This is the earliest record of feathers known so far. What does this mean? Does it mean that all feathers evolved in one fell swoop? No, probably not. Most likely, feathers first evolved in some other animals, and only later did they begin to appear in dinosaurs. But the fact remains, Microraptor was the first feathered dinosaur. But who was it? There are over 1,000 described species of dinosaurs, and there are probably millions of undescribed ones. That's why when you hear about the first feathered dinosaur, you may think that this is definitely the most famous dinosaur. But no, Microraptor was a small animal that looked like a big chicken. It reached a length of 1 meter and weighed a little less than a kilogram. Scientists estimate that this dinosaur hunted insects. You've probably heard about Archaeopteryx. It also had feathers and was also about the size of a big chicken. However, despite its feathery appearance, Archaeopteryx was not a bird. In fact, it was a relative of Ankylosaurus. According to the current classification of dinosaurs, Microraptor and Archaeopteryx belong to different subclasses. In other words, they are about as related to each other as a frog is to a salamander. So which of them was the first? And here comes the twist. Despite the fact that Microraptor is older than Archaeopteryx, the latter appeared in Europe long before it appeared in Asia. Moreover, the remains of Archaeopteryx have been known to science since 1861, while the first mention of Microraptor dates back to 1996. So why haven't we heard about Microraptor before? The thing is that in 1996, scientists found only a few feathers that could easily be mistaken for modern feathers. Therefore, they decided that this dinosaur was nothing more than an ordinary bird. Only in 2000, another specimen of this dinosaur was discovered, and only then did scientists realize that they had to do with a unique animal. In 2014, a group of researchers led by Canadian paleontologist Matthew Lamana came to the conclusion that the oldest known feathers evolved convergently. What does that mean? It means that feathers could have evolved independently many times in completely different groups of animals. For example, feathers may have evolved independently in crustaceans, mollusks, insects, and vertebrates. But the question arises, if feathers evolved independently, then why are they all exactly the same? There are many types of feathers, but they are all made up of the same structure. And this structure is perfect for flight, but hardly could have evolved by chance. Why did all animals independently come to the same conclusion, how to build a feather? Researchers have hypothesized that feathers may have originally evolved for insulation, and only later did they begin to perform the function of flight. However, this hypothesis has its drawbacks. After all, the function of feathers is not only to keep warm, but also to make flying more efficient. Feathers reduce air resistance, and this is very important for animals that fly long distances every day. Moreover, feathers help the animal to maintain its balance in the air, and this is extremely important because otherwise the bird simply could fall and break its wings. But it is unlikely that feathers could evolve to perform these functions in just a few million years. Perhaps feathers first evolved for sexual selection, as they do in birds today. Male birds often attract females with bright colors and beautiful shapes. This is the main purpose of feathers, and only secondarily did they begin to perform other functions. Be that as it may, feathers were very useful for dinosaurs, and it is easy to see why. In the age of dinosaurs, the climate was mostly warm, but it often changed drastically. For example, during the Triassic, the climate was mostly dry and hot, but in the middle of the period, it suddenly got much colder. Only animals that could withstand low temperatures survived. And one of the ways to keep warm was, of course, feathers. Moreover, feathers could have appeared under the influence of viruses. After all, the structure of feathers is very similar to the structure of hair. And many scientists agree that dinosaurs were covered in hair before feathers. Now let's get back to the animals that we're talking about. Today, who was the first feathered dinosaur? Probably Microraptor. But this dinosaur was not the ancestor of birds. Birds descended from another group of theropods called Maniraptorines. The ancestors of birds appeared at the end of the Cretaceous, and the first birds took off into the sky in the early Paleogene. Some scientists even suggest that birds did not evolve from dinosaurs at all. They believe that dinosaurs and birds are equally removed from a common ancestor, and that both of them belong to one group called Theropods. This hypothesis is called the theropod hypothesis. Its supporters point out that birds and dinosaurs have much more in common than, say, turtles and alligators. After all, turtles and alligators are more like crocodiles, while birds are more like velociraptors. Be that as it may, there is no doubt that the ancestors of birds were small feathered theropods. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly which ones yet, but maybe someday we will find the remains of the first bird. By the way, if you think that dinosaurs were lizards, check out my video showing how terrifying these ancient reptiles really were. And that's all for today. See you soon. Bye.